Nothing gets me more upset than when I hear doctors and therapists continue to perpetuate the myth that stroke recovery stops after 1 year. It is 2024. They should know better. Let's unpack this. This myth likely started as the result of multiple studies published between the 1960s and the 1980s. And my primary source for this video is a 2015 clinical review that was published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, Nutrition, and Metabolism. I'll leave a link in the description in case you want to check it out. Now, there was data from some animal studies during this time period that, quote, indicate there is a critical time window of recovery. Specifically, in a few studies that looked at strokes in rats, they found that neuron or brain cell changes were completed at the end of the first month, which may be why one of the recommendations for stroke rehab from a study in 1981 stated, quote, widespread investment in rehabilitation service beyond 6 months following a stroke is likely to be wasteful. In a 1965 study, they reported that 116 participants who had a paralyzed arm after their stroke reached a maximum recovery during the 6th and 7th months. And last, but perhaps the most important point from these studies is that these studies looked at recovery where either no intervention or only passive interventions were applied, rather than active rehabilitation after 6 months. Now that we understand where this myth sort of started from, let's talk about why it's wrong. So specifically, in that time frame between the 60s and 80s, many researchers looked at stroke recovery in animals. However, while animal studies can be helpful for some things, they don't necessarily translate to humans. Number 2, some human studies during that period only really measured recovery for the first 3 months. Maybe those researchers made the assumption that recovery doesn't continue after that time frame because they didn't measure it, but that doesn't make it correct. What we have come to understand about the brain after a neurological injury is that there is a heightened state of neuroplasticity in that first 3 to 6 months after the stroke. And this means this is an increased time to create new pathways and for the brain to reorganize. This is also the time period where even if you didn't do any active rehabilitation, you will likely still see some amount of progress. However, after that period is over, progress typically slows down because the brain's ability to make those neuroplastic changes also slows down. It's not in that hyperdrive corrective mode anymore, but it's returning to kind of that baseline neuroplastic ability which we have throughout our lives. Number 3, many of the measurement scales during that time frame were not as sensitive as they needed to be to detect small changes in stroke recovery. After the initial state of that hyper-neuroplasticity, usually in that first 3 to 6 months, progress starts to slow. It doesn't stop, but those milestones become smaller and they take longer to reach. So for example, in a 1965 study, they graded participants who were post-stroke. They graded their walking ability in 3 different categories. Now, I'm not entirely sure exactly what those 3 categories were, but I would venture to guess they were not walking, maybe walking with assistance, meaning like a device, like a walker or a cane, and walking without assistance. Well, if you made progress with your walking, let's say for example, you went from using a walker to using a cane, that's a huge amount of progress, but under that 3 category scale, you wouldn't actually show any progress because you still require assistance. And number 4, very few of the human studies that occurred during this time period actually involved rehabilitation to activate active neuroplasticity. This is neuroplasticity occurring as the result of targeted rehab. Many studies focused on passive recovery, whatever recovery happened spontaneously without actually trying, or on passive exercises, which is where somebody else was guiding the exercises and the person didn't really actively try. Let me relate this to neuroplasticity evidence that we have now, specifically based on the gold standard 2008 article by Klein and Jones. The first principle of neuroplasticity is use it or lose it. We have to do things actively to stimulate neuroplastic changes in our brain, whether it's after a neurological injury or we're just trying to learn something new. So now that we understand the shortcomings of these studies, why is this toxic myth still being spread by some medical professionals? Well, Some still misinterpret the passive neuroplasticity timeline as the only stroke recovery window, saying that the first 3 to 6 months up to a year is the only time that someone is going to see progress when it's still happening spontaneously. Some clinicians may not keep up with the latest evidence and just be going off of what they learned years ago. Some websites and textbooks that active clinicians use may not have the most up-to-date data. Although if a provider says that they practice as an evidence-based clinician, they should be keeping up with the latest evidence using multiple reputable sources. And lastly, they don't want to provide false hope or misinformation. And as a clinician, I can sort of understand this because there's a fine line to balance between providing false hope and realistic expectations when it comes to stroke recovery. But the truth is that placing a false timeline on recovery will detrimentally, completely remove hope, and ultimately, I think, does more damage than it does good. We as clinicians and researchers don't actually know how much progress someone is going to make. Every stroke survivor is different. Every stroke is different. Every stroke recovery trajectory is different. And we can't, at this point, wholly and accurately predict how much someone is going to recover. In fact, what we know now is that the potential for progress is always possible. And I say this both from an anecdotal perspective as a clinician who has worked with stroke survivors who I've seen make progress 15, 20 plus years after their stroke, but I also say this based on evidence. A 2014 study that looked at 37 studies found that an increase in therapy is beneficial in terms of progress regardless of post-stroke times, whether someone was several months or years after their stroke. And in the 2013 Canadian Best Practice Recommendations for Stroke Care, the inclusion criteria for stroke rehab includes both stroke survivors who are in the acute phase, as well as those who are over 1 year past their stroke. And I have a few other studies that I'll be linking in the description if you'd like to check those out. But I think that this quote from a 2009 article best sums it up. We know now the time window for stroke recovery, as with that of normal learning, never really closes. Understanding this, it's up to all of us, evidence-based clinicians, stroke survivors, caregivers, stroke foundations, to debunk this myth. Share this video or share with your own voice on social media, with your local support group, or even with your doctor if they confront you with this outdated idea. We have to help stroke survivors understand that recovery doesn't have an expiration date. Strokes take so much. Let's not let them take our hope as well. I want to give a huge thank you to all of our donors who make videos like this possible. Whether you donate via a super thanks on YouTube, via PayPal, by sending us a check to our PO box, or by becoming a Patreon member. And a special thank you to Heather G, Ryan D, and Modus Nova in our Empower tier on Patreon. I'll leave links in the description if you'd like to help support post-stroke too. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time.